be seated. Honorable members, we shall now resume with the fourth order. Yeah. Okay, go ahead. The secretary will read the fourth order.
Consideration of report of Portfolio Committee on Defense and Military Veterans on Defense Amendment Bill.
I now recognize the Chief Whip.
Honourable Speaker, I move that the report be adopted by this House.
Are there any objections? No objections. Agreed to. We now come to the fifth order.
Order, Madam Speaker. EFF object.
There being an objection, that order shall be turned into a notice of motion.
We shall report the objection.
We shall report. We now come to the fifth order. The secretary will read the fifth order.
Second reading debate, Defense Amendment Bill.
The Honorable, the Minister of Defense and Military Veterans.
Honorable Speaker, Deputy Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, Honorable Mapatsuwe, fellow Cabinet colleagues and Deputy Ministers, Chairperson of the Portfolio Committee on Defense and Military Veterans, Honorable Stanley Mutimele, and members of the Portfolio Committee. Honorable members, we are gathered here today for the second reading of the Defense Amendment Bill as passed by the Portfolio Committee on Defense. This comes after extensive consultations on the bill, including public participation. Members will recall that this amendment follows on the Defense Act of 2002, itself a product of years of overhauling the Apartheid-era Defense Act of 1957. Unlike when we took through the 2002 Defense Act, the bill seeks to effect relatively minor amendments to have it attuned to the changed organizational structure of the SANDF, delegation of powers, utilization of the Defense Force in international waters, regulate matters related to the reserves, etc. The objects of the bill are to mention the most salient highlights. One, to include the Chief of Staff in the military command of the Defense Force by the insertion of Section 4A, Clause 1. It is practice that the Chief of Staff is part of the Military Command Council structure. It is necessary, therefore, to formalize this appointment and position. Two, to clarify the process in Section 8E regarding the implementation by the Chiefs of the Defense Force of the delegation of powers and assignment of duties to members by the Secretary for Defense as head and accounting officer of the department. The Secretary for Defense cannot directly delegate any of his functions to members of the SANDF without the consent of the Chief of the South African National Defense Force, as it would be contrary to the command and control principles of the SANDF. In order to enable a member of the SANDF to carry out any function of the SecDef must give specific guidelines to the Chief of the SANDF in order to enable the Chief of the SANDF to instruct the member to carry out the delegation. This also will provide for the employment of the Defense Force internationally, whereas currently the wording which we have in our legislation refers to international waters, which has a specific meaning in international law. The amendment seeks to expand the international deployment of the SANDF by not only restricting it, therefore, to international waters. It also provides for the security vetting of contractors and service providers who are procured through the department. We are now here requesting that Defense Intelligence should be empowered to screen and vet the security of all contractors and service providers to the Department of Defense. We are also proposing that minutes of meetings, which is the highest decision-making forum of the Defense Force, which is the Council on Defense, that these minutes should be properly regulated and that they should be properly noted. And this we are not taking lightly, hence we are putting it in our legislation because this is where decisions, critical decisions of the Defense Force are taken. Clarify also that a person does not need the consent of an employer in order to enroll or to remain a member of the reserve force. The current tradition, Chair, is that if a person is employed, a person would then solicit support of the employer in order for the person to join the reserve force. Also to regulate the termination of service of members of the regular force, to expand and create legislative provisions under which the service of members is terminated by operation of law and the circumstances under which members' services may be administratively discharged. The provisions of the current Section 59 of the Defense Act were retained in the bill, while provisions from the general regulations of the SANDF and the reserve were also incorporated into the bill. The amended provisions in Section 59 of the bill is particularly aimed at empowering the commanders who are first and foremost directly involved in disciplinary matters of members. This amendment is directly related to managing the constitutional imperatives of the SANDF as contained in Section 200 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa of 1996, which requires that the SANDF be structured and mannered as a disciplined military force.
Honorable Minister, your time has expired.
Thank you very much, Chair.
The Honorable Mutimele.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker, Honorable Minister of Defense and Military Veterans, Honorable Nosiviwe Mapisa Nakula, Deputy Minister, Honorable Kebi Mapatswe, Honorable Members of Parliament. The Defense Amendment Bill B18 of 2017 was submitted to the Portfolio Committee on Defense and Military Veterans by the Department in June 2017. The bill seeks to align the Defense Act 2 of 2002 with current departmental organizational requirements to enhance the efficiency of defense and military veterans. The amendments are organizational in nature and apply internally to the Department of Defense. Various consultations were conducted with stakeholders within the Department of Defense, and the bill was published for public comment in line with all public participation processes. No responses were received. The committee agreed that the regulation will be dealt with at a later stage. The report of the bill was adopted without amendments. The amendment bill amends the Principal Act by inter alia, providing for the inclusion of a Chief of Corporate Staff in the Military Command of the South African National Defence Force, which is established by Section 4A of the Act. The Chief of Corporate Staff will be on the same level as Chiefs of Services and Divisions in the SADC already included in the command. The Defense Amendment Act of 2010 for the first time set out the composition of the military command. The Chief of Corporate Staff, as the staff officer of the Chief of the SADC, is critical for the proper functioning and coordination of the activities of the SADC, hence the need to include the Chief of Corporate Staff in the military command. Among other amendments, the bill provides for the security of vetting contractors and service providers of the department. The issue of security at our military bases remains one of paramount importance. Therefore, the bill also provides for the prohibition of access to military property or areas. That is, citizens should be made aware and be warned that you do not just stumble in a military area without notice. The amendment empowers the minister to prescribe measures to regulate access into military property or areas. The amendments provide for the simplification of matters when it comes to the identification cards issued to military police officials. Currently, the wording of the Act requires that regulations regarding this identification card be promulgated by the minister. The amendments provide for this issue to be dealt with by means of internal policies instead of regulations. The bill proposes an amendment to the requirement for legal representation in order to align Section 60 of the Defense Act with the Treasury regulations regarding legal representation of SADC members provided by the state in respect of an act committed in an official capacity. The bill also seeks to regulate the display of military decorations, medals, and insignia. This aspect will be dealt with in the rules rather than the regulations. The bill proposes that the criminal enforcement of the unlawful possession or wearing of military uniforms, distinctive marks or crests be regulated anew by amending Section 104. This amendment is necessary as the unlawful wearing of military uniform does not only risk bringing the defense force into disrepute, but it also confuses members of the public. The amendment bill not only enhances the efficiency within the Department of Defense and Military Veterans, it also strengthens our territorial integrity and upholding the reputation of the Defense Force. We therefore, Honorable Speaker, propose that the bill be adopted by this House. I thank you.
The Honorable Esau.
Honourable Speaker, the Defence Amendment Bill addresses the inefficiencies and therefore proposes changes to the Defence Act of 2002, and we acknowledge that this will be in the best interest of the military. It affects also the Ministry of Defence, the Secretariat of Defence, and also the Department of Defence. And it needs to address also the relationship between the Chief of Defence and the Secretary of Defence in order for delegations to be implemented. The concern we have is about the vetting processes for service providers and contractors. Normally the Department of State Security does that, and now we need the Defence Intelligence to take responsibility for the DOD's vetting of contractors and service providers. We know that in the past we had serious challenges, and we speak about empowerment and capacity. The issue is that there is no budget increase within the Defence Intelligence except for cybersecurity. So we just want to urge the Minister that within the financial constraints of that particular program, that we're able to effect the necessary changes to have a functional, effective defense intelligence that can vet. And it's important that we do not employ service providers and contractors in the military facilities, which are very sensitive areas. The other issue, of course, we acknowledge insignia and medals and decorations that should be regulated, uniform, and to prevent the abuse of uniform. And of course, the prohibition of access. The concern I have with the access, we support that 100%. The issue is about the infrastructure. Does it align with the Critical Infrastructure Act that was passed in place of the National Key Points Act? Because within those acts, we speak about also the security that must be added besides the prohibition of access. Now, we know that there are also budgetary constraints in that regard, and that this bill that we have is a process of the amendment process, so we anticipate further amendments to be done. We also acknowledge that the defense review has not been taken in consideration at this time, because that is also under reconsideration and review concerning its implementation, and that will, of course, be, also have an impact later when we have to do further amendments to the Defense Act. The issue that the regulatory environment will be regulated and simplified, I think that is encouraged. And of course, we see there will be shifts from regulations to policies, policies to rules, rules to determinations, and also the capacity for new regulations to be drafted in order to facilitate this regulatory environment. The legal representation, we welcome that, and also in terms of our democracy, that also if there are people on official duty, that they also have the recourse to legal representation, which we support. The Reserve Force members, I think we acknowledge that if they can serve and be registered without the necessary permission being required from an employer. So that relationship, we must just ensure that employers understand the need for reserves to be on standby, and it is, of course, an honor to serve your country and to be on standby to defend your country. Essentially, the amendments enhance military discipline, and I think we would like to see the military discipline bill also coming to the table, and that we also implement that as soon as possible.
Excuse me, Honorable Esau. What's the point, Honorable person?
Apologies to the Speaker for interrupting, but the Honourable Vessel...
On what point are you rising?
The Honourable Vessels was removed from the House, told to leave the House earlier today, and is back here again.
Honorable member, you know that you were removed from the House. And when you are removed from the House, it's supposed to be for the rest of the day.
Achtbare Speaker.
So, wait, Honorable Groenewald, I'm just finishing the matter at hand. Could you please let the Honorable member...
Now, before I leave, Honourable Speaker, a point of order on that matter. We've listened, Honourable Speaker, we've listened to the tape, the video. And how can you say no? I've listened.
Honourable Groenewald,
Honourable Speaker,
can you allow us to just finish this business?
Yes. Can I ask you?
Order.
Honourable.
Achtbare Speaker, die lid was gevra om die podium te verlaat, nie om die raadsaal te verlaat.
Can the honourable member please leave the House? Honourable member, I am advised that you were removed from the House and you are supposed to stay out for the rest of the day. And therefore, I am not having a debate with you. I am just requesting you to leave and not be here for the rest of the day. Honourable member, you are now delaying us. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Honorable Groenewald, what is your point? Is it still relevant?
Honorable Speaker, if it was not relevant, I wouldn't have asked to address you.
Okay, go ahead and address me.
Can I then just ask you in future that if a decision is made by the chair and the presiding officer, that it is quite clear, because the honourable member Wessels was asked to leave the podium, and you can go and check the video. If a person has to leave the house, he must be ordered to leave the house, not to leave the podium. So the terminology must be corrected. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll check on that record and we'll come and report to the House. Honorable Esau, sorry to disturb you, but you can finish off.
In conclusion, the DA supports the appointment bill. Thank you very much.
The Honorable Mhlongo.
Honorable Speaker, the Defence Amendment Bill before us today is a wrong answer to a poorly crafted question. It takes away our focus from crocodiles chasing after this great nation to the lizards, which is a useless act. The real challenge facing our Defence Force today has little to do with the amendments suggested to the Defence Act of 2002. The Defence Amendment Bill deals with administrative matters relating to the powers of the Defence Secretary, the powers of the Minister to make regulations, and the deployment of our forces to international missions. These pale in comparison to what are the real challenges facing the Defence Force that need legislative amendments. From 2002, we have had one report after another detailing the extent of decline of our Defence Force. The 2015 Defence Review report starkly demonstrated that the decline in defence allocation has declined year on year by approximately 5% per annum in real terms over the last 20 years to less than 1% of the gross domestic product, resulting in the loss of essential defence capabilities. The result of this has been horrendous, and the Defence Review noted the consequences as loss of significant impact on the capacity and capabilities of the Department of Defence and the level of our country to defend ambitions in support of national interests and foreign policy. A properly thought legislative mechanism ought to have dealt with the funding model of our Defence Force to ensure that the ambitions of the Defence Force and the resources available are not out of sync with each other. The Defence Review did not end on the matter of funding alone. It also advocated a role for the military in support of South African developmental state and the harnessing of national resources to the benefit of the population as a whole. The review claimed could have done through the virtues of military services in socializing and educating young adults and enhancing the national skills base, the economic benefits that might flow from military procurements to local businesses and national industry, and the support that military engineers and medical staff, as well as the Air Force, can sometimes provide for civilian projects. None of these things have been done, Madam Speaker. No plan has been put in place to ensure this happens, and as a result, the real potential the military has to unlock economic benefits for our country has not been realized. We could, however, be training doctors, technicians, engineers, military scientists, pilots at a large scale, while at the same time improving our capability to defend our nation. As a result of this negligence by this government, just 2 of our 9 C-130 aircrafts are flying. This is because we have no coherent plan for training pilots for our Defence Force. If we were serious, therefore, about improving our defense force, we would not be entertaining the artificial amendments proposed by this amendment bill. Rather, we would be focusing on rebuilding our defense force through legislative measures, but also through policies and sound leadership to lift it out of the quagmire it finds itself in. Right now, in our last meeting of Defense and Public Works,
Honorable
we have got a
Member,
hospital where
I regret
millions
your
were
time has
plundered in
expired.
First State Hospital because of failures of this parliament to oversee activities of the corrupt Department of Public Works. For this reason,
Honorable
EFF does
Member,
reject this.
your time
Thank
has
you very much.
expired.
Thank you.
The Honorable Cebekulu.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. This bill firstly seeks to formalize the position of Chief of Staff in the existing military command structure. In general, it seeks to align Defence Act 2002, Act number 42 of 2002, with current departmental organizational requirements to enhance the efficiency of defence and military veterans. It amends, although largely organizational in nature and applicable internally to the Department of Defense, bring much needed structural realignment to our ailing defense force and thus military defense capability. It looks at the realignment of providing effective organizational defense capability according to the principles of quote-unquote defense in a democracy, with its primary and external mission being the conventional function of defense against foreign military aggression. The bill also importantly expands the wording of Section 18.1 and international deployment of South African National Defence Force by not only restricting it to international waters, which approach is consistent with movement in international law. With the current status and defense capability of our South African National Defence Force, it is equally important that we bolster and make it simpler for military-trained citizens to join our service, our reserve forces. Clause 7 addresses this by removing the prior concern that was required by an employer upon an employee joining the reserve forces. Fitness and morale of the troops in South African National Defence Force currently low and health is poor. The suggested amendment to Clause 13 will empower the minister prescribe regulations concerning health and fitness of troops. This is paramount if we are to have disciplined, fit, healthy, and effective defense force capability. In order for the SANDF to be a balanced, modern, and technologically advanced military force capable and executing its task effectively and efficiently, it is paramount that it keeps pace with global military technology advancements. SANDF peacekeeping forces that are sent out on missions ill-equipped with defective technology will always end in disaster. If we are to bolster the morale of our troops, let's begin by providing them with every advantage to successfully conduct and carry out their missions. I thank you.
The Honorable Mncwabe.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. The National Freedom Party welcomes the aims and objectives of the amendment to the current Defence Act of 2002. We have noted that the amendment seeks to formalize the position of the Chief of Staff within the military. We also commend that the amendment provides for the security vetting of contract and service providers of the department. We believe that this will go a long way in fighting corruption and irregularities within the department. Our overall observation as the party is that the main objectives of the amendment is to realign certain functions within the Defence Force with the current structure of the Department of Defence and Military Veterans, which in our view is an acceptable move. Lastly, the NFP supports the Defence Amendment Bill. Thank you.
The Honorable Groenewald.
Speaker, ek wil in die eerste plek van die geleentheid gebruik maak om die Vryheidsfront Plus se leedwese uit te spreek met die afsterwe van generaal Jannie Geldenhuys, 'n vorige hoof van die Suid-Afrikaanse weermag, en wil ons vir sy gesin en sy familie ons innige meegevoel betuig en mag hulle vertroosting ontvang van ons hemelse Vader. Generaal Geldenhuys was bekend dat hy nie net 'n soldaat was nie, maar hy was ook 'n kenner van politiek en het hy 'n groot rol gespeel, ook in die politieke ontwikkeling, selfs as hoof van die Suid-Afrikaanse weermag, maar hy was ook 'n mens. Hy het ook die menswees van 'n soldaat goed geken en almal het hom gerespekteer. So ons wens die familie sterkte toe. Agbare Speaker, as ek kom by die wetsontwerp, uit die aard van die saak is dit 'n aantal tegniese veranderinge wat ter sprake is, maar die belangrike is byvoorbeeld dat daar 'n hele aantal verandering is in terme van om beter dissipline te handhaaf in die Suid-Afrikaanse nasionale weermag. As ek een voorbeeld kan vat, byvoorbeeld dat as 'n lid vir 10 agtereenvolgende dae afwesig was sonder verlof, dat so 'n lid se diens dan beëindig word. Dit is kommerwekkend, agbare Speaker, dat as 'n mens rondbeweeg en dan sien 'n mens dat persone in uniform rondbeweeg in die openbaar, en ja, natuurlik van hulle sal toestemming hê, maar jy kan ook sien, baie van hulle het eenvoudig net gaan inklok en dan het hulle maar net weer die basis verlaat. Ek het al gesien in Potchefstroom dat daar eintlik gespog word dat ons bly net tot 10 uur in die basis, daarna gaan loop ons rond in die dorp. En daarom verwelkom ons hierdie tipe van maatreëls. En die agbare minister weet dit ook, dat daar moet streng gekyk na dissipline. 'n Ander aspek is byvoorbeeld dat die minister die magte en die bevoegdhede het om sekere maatreëls aan te kondig om militêre basisse meer veilig te maak. Agbare minister, ons ondersteun dit. Maar die werklikheid is, dis ook onaanvaarbaar dat 'n mens dan in die media moet verneem van wagte by ingange van militêre basisse wat aan die slaap is, wat oorval word deur misdadigers met messe, en dan word die wagte van hulle wapens in terme van R4 gewere ontneem, as ook hulle lewendige ammunisie. En dit is nie aanvaarbaar dat ons sulke swak dissipline het nie. So hierdie maatreëls is wel in plek, maar ek wil 'n beroep op die agbare minister doen om te verseker dat die dissipline moet absoluut opgeskerp word in die Suid-Afrikaanse nasionale weermag. Want ons kan watse wette maak, ons kan watse reëls maak. Die sukses daarvan gaan afhang hoe gedissiplineerd ons lede dit gaan toepas. Dit is moontlik, ons kan hulle behoorlike gedissiplineerde opleiding gee, en slegs dan sal 'n wetsontwerp soos hierdie wel sy nut hê. Die Vryheidsfront Plus sal dit ondersteun.
The Honorable Mare.
Madam Speaker, I apologize. The Honourable Murray is indisposed. He's not going to be able to make the debate this afternoon.
Okay. Honorable.
It means he's had surgery, which you need to your brain.
Honorable Gamete.
Okay. Honorable Speaker, the Minister and Deputy Minister of Defence and Military Veterans, Ministers and Deputy Ministers present, and honorable members. Firstly, the ANC supports
On a point of order,
this
Speaker.
bill.
On a point of order, Speaker.
What's the point of order?
I think the minister was raising her hand there, and I will never let any man undermine a woman like that in my presence.
Honorable member,
Now,
please
I
take-
want that man of the DA to
Honorable-
withdraw that
honorable
statement that he
member,
have said.
please take
It
your
was
seat.
wrong. It was wrong. It should never be allowed. You've been bullying
Honorable
us the
member,
whole
just take
morning
your
like
seat.
this.
I have not
You've been
allowed
such a
you
bully and a
to
spoiled
make a
brat the whole
speech.
morning. We can't allow that. You can't allow that.
Please proceed, Honorable Gamete.
A point of order, Chair.
What's the point of order, Honorable?
The point of order, Chair, is that honorable member actually insulted me. And therefore, honorable, I beg your indulgence. He needs to retract because he needs to withdraw because akakwazi ukungithuka ngengqondo yami. Akakwazi ukuyenza le nto le. If ungazwanga speaker ngizocela ukuthi uyilalele lento ayishilo bese sidila ngayo afterwards.
I will
Thank
do
you.
that. And I'll refer to the Hansard and I'll bring back the issue. Honorable Gamete, please proceed.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. I've said for starters, the ANC supports the amendment of this bill, B18-2017. South Africa's national interest is centered on the advancement of its sovereignty, democracy, national values and freedoms, and its political economic independence. South African national security focuses on its sovereignty and other related priorities of territorial integrity, constitutional order, the security and continuance of national institutions, the well-being, prosperity and upliftment of the people and the growth of the economy. South Africa's national security inextricably hinges on the stability, unity, prosperity of the South African region and the continent in general. South Africa's military capacity are commensurate with South Africa's international status, strategic posture, and inescapable leadership role. The Defense Force plays a vital, unique, and contributes to that, complements South Africa's diplomatic efforts, enhances South Africa's influence within wider international development. As South Africa expands its leadership role, it continuously assumes the obligation to provide experienced military leaders and proficient military forces for peace, missions, and other military operations. The amendments of the intended bill is to align it to the Defense Act of 2002 as mentioned. Clause 1 proposes that the Chief of Staff be included in the military command. Clause 2 proposes clarification on the process of Section 8E regarding the implementation of the Chief of the Defense Force. Clause 3 proposes that provision be made for the employment of the Defense Force outside the Republic. Clause 4 proposes to simplify matters regarding identification cards issued to military police officials. Clause 5 proposes a technical correction to the reference to the amendments. Clause 6 proposes the improved regulation of the minutes of the meetings of the Council on Defense. Clause 7 proposes to clarify that a person does not need the consent of the employer to enroll or to remain as a member of the reserve force. Clause 8 proposes to regulate anew the termination of service of members. Clause 9 proposes an amendment to the requirement for legal representation for members in order to align Section 60 of the Defense Act. Now, these two following clauses are very important. Clause 10, 11, and 12, which propose an amendment regarding the manner in which the display of military decorations, medals, insignia, and the use of military uniform, distinctive marks, and crests are regulated. Clause 13 proposes to amend certain powers of the minister to make the amendment which will empower the minister to prescribe the regulations on the medical establishment of health and fitness standards and the provision of dental and hospital treatment. Clause 14 proposes the amendment of a heading. Clause 15 proposes provision for regulation, the prohibition of access to military areas. The last amendment, which is which we request all the members of parliament to communicate to all the communities, is clause 16. Clause 16 proposes that the criminal enforcement of the unlawful possession of wearing of military uniforms, distinctive marks or crests be regulated anew by the amendment of the Act, which means it will be now a criminal offense for anyone to wear a uniform that is similar to the Defence Force. The Defence Force Amendment Bill is envisaged to align to the Defence Act. We therefore, as the ANC, support the amendment to this bill with a big smile. I thank you.
The Honorable, the Minister of Defence and Military Veterans.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Honorable Speaker, honorable members, thank you for supporting this amendment to the bill. And I would like to make an appeal to the Portfolio Committee to also fast-track the Military Discipline Bill, which has long been outstanding, because it will help enhance our work of creating a disciplined force, and a highly professionalized one for that matter. I also want to thank the honorable members for making reference to almost all the issues which we are amending in this bill, and with specific reference, I must say, to the wearing of military uniforms, distinctive marks or crests, is now going to be regulated anew. This is a matter we all know has created a lot of problems. This now will assist us to enforce it rather than to be talking about it without taking action. We cannot afford to have so many military uniforms being worn all over by anyone, and thereby creating a situation where we have paramilitary structures which are not registered. Lastly, Honorable Speaker, the area of the reserve force, I'm sure honorable members will recall that during the budget vote, one of the matters I raised was that there is a need to overhaul the reserve force. And of course, I'm aware that last week on Friday, the Reserve Force Council made some presentations to the Joint Committee of Defense. I'm also aware that there is work being done in the department to deal with the same issues. The reality is that we depend a lot on the reserve force, and therefore we have to regulate them in a manner such that it is easy for us to have access to them, but it is also well organized, and that corruption should not be allowed in the process of getting people to come into the system and serve and exit again, because obviously by the virtue of being reserve force members, they are not full-time members of the regular force. Lastly, Chair, of course, the matter of the decorations has been raised, and I'm very happy about it. We have seen people who are wearing all manner of decorations and medals, some of which we've not recognized them as those belonging to the South African National Defence Force, and even those belonging to the statutory force, the South African Defence Force. So thank you very much, honorable members. Thank you for the support, and thank you for the quick manner in which you dealt with these issues in the Portfolio Committee. Thank you.
That concludes the debate. Are there any objections to the bill being read a second time? No objections. Agreed to. The Secretary will read the bill a second time.
Defence Amendment Bill.
The bill will be sent to the National Council of Provinces for concurrence. The Secretary will read the sixth order of the day.
Consideration of request for permission in terms of Rule 286(4)C to inquire into amending other provisions of Copyright Act 1978, number 78 of 1978.
I was expecting to be seeing Honorable Fabs, the chairperson of the committee, who will introduce the report, but I see the Honorable Khadebe's pretty face here.
Speaker,
Yes, Honorable Sengue.
this is not fair to the Honorable German Cut. He was demoted as a whip. Now he's being demoted here to come to the podium. This is unfair.
We sympathize with you for feeling that he's been unfairly treated. Honorable Fabs, please proceed.
Good afternoon, Honourable Speaker. Good afternoon, Honourable Members of this House. This is an interim report of the Portfolio Committee on Trade and Industry in terms of the National Assembly Rule 2864C on the Copyright Amendment Bill, B13/2017. And it seeks essentially to address the scope of the bill. The bill came to the House, the bill was recrafted by the committee, and from the submissions, written and oral, and the deliberations that we received, and taking into account we worked with arts and culture, we worked with a variety of departments and ministries, it became apparent from those, the artists themselves, that there was a need for clearer definitions. So we had to capture that. There was also a recognition that the bill tabled in this Parliament did not effectively deal with collecting societies. And that we all know, or perhaps we may not, that they remain unregulated, which is one of the primary reasons why artists do not receive what is due to them. And we go on to the resale of royalty rights. How do we protect this? So essentially, the bill has captured those gaps that existed and listened to the many submissions. And when I say admissions, Honourable Speaker, they were appeals and pleas from people who died before I stand here. And we have taken them as a committee seriously on board. We also dealt with the establishment of a copyright tribunal as an alternative mechanism. We can't continue to send everything to the courts and clog them up. So essentially then, Honourable Speaker, the committee recommends that the National Assembly grants permission in terms of Assembly Rule 2864C for it to amend other provisions of the Copyright Act number 78 of number 1978. I thank you.
Are there any objections to the committee being granted permission in terms of Rule 2864C to inquire into amending other provisions of the Copyright Act?
Madam Speaker, no objection, but we would like to make a declaration.
You want to make a declaration? You are allowed to make that declaration, Honorable Steenhuisen.
Madam Speaker, copyright law is a complex minefield and is preferably informed by international best practice and expert views. The bill, currently in the committee stage, addresses certain issues that have been crying out to be dealt with for decades, and as such, the report merits support. It makes laudable strides to modernize the Copyright Act of 1978, which is badly out of date, while the world has been moving forward at a dizzy pace. Remember, though, a fundamental of copyright protection is that it should not outweigh the right of freedom of expression, which remains a fundamental tenet of constitutional democracy. The bill grapples with two approaches, fair use and fair dealing. Both aim to enhance creativity. Fair use provides a principles-based test to see if a use is permitted or not, while fair dealing specifies permissible uses in legislation. In respect of the bill, criticisms have been leveled, and some of these are now under review. One example is the terminology of the bill, which continues to foster uncertainty. The scope of fair use and fair dealing remains a controversial section of the bill, and the committee has now embarked on a hybrid option. However, this approach may well fudge the issue by continuing to shoehorn some uses into narrow legislative provisions. The ownership of the state by the state of state-funded works is another problematic section. Its arbitrary deprivation of a person's right to property may be unconstitutional, and one can think of many practical situations where this would be untenable. Then there is the introduction of resale royalty rights. Here an artist can claim to receive a portion of the resale price of her artwork and when onward sales are made. The implication on the art market and ownership are significant, as are issues of retrospective application. There is a presumption against retrospective legislation, and while enacted law trumps common law, it is essentially inferior. There are also possible unconstitutional aspects of the bill that allow the minister responsible for communication to prescribe, instead of ICASA, local music content for television and radio broadcasting. All these issues merit attention, but the ANC's proclivity to be driven by populist redress without due consideration of the legal and socio-economic consequences must be guarded against. This has prompted Professor D. Owen Dean, Chair of Intellectual Property Law at Stellenbosch University, to say, and I quote, "I regret to say that I have not come across a piece of intellectual property writing that is as badly formulated and presented, that exhibits such a lack of understanding of the basic principles of the subject. It contains terminology which is foreign to the Act and rides roughshod over the basic principles of copyright law. The bill is riddled with contradictions and anomalies. It is frequently nonsensical or downright incomprehensible, even to someone who can claim to be an expert knowledge of the subject matter." The slapdash drafting of the bill is now being addressed, and one hopes that there will be a satisfactory resolution in committee. Thankfully, some of the criticisms from stakeholders are being taken seriously. But, as the bill has been described, it remains a curate's egg. Some authorities define a curate's egg as something that is in an indeterminate mix of good and bad. Others say it implies a preponderance of bad qualities, all of which lamentably describes the bill which currently sits before us. Copyright could do a much better job if freed from constraints to drive and incentivize ongoing creation and access, to give creators a fair shot and improve the preservation and dissemination of our cultural heritage. Currently, neglected value could be unlocked and the pie made bigger. We need to disaggregate incentives and rewards, and in doing so, as with all things, we must be mindful of the sanctity of contracts. Contracts and intellectual property go hand in hand. The right to property implies the right to make contracts about that property, to give it away or to exchange titles of ownership for the property of another person. Best, we do not lose sight of this in all our endeavors. I assure you the DA won't.
The EFF.
Thank you, Speaker. While the EFF have no fundamental problem with the Copyright Act being amended, we do, however, think it is important what the amendments will be to the 40-year-old piece of legislation, as the devil is always in the details. Copywriting is a very sensitive issue. For centuries, white settlers have used this concept of an idea of copywriting and patents to claim what wasn't theirs and profit from it throughout the world. We have seen that in Louis Vuitton with the Basotho blanket. We have seen that with the Amaxhosa patent of Sahara. We have seen that. Exploiting the knowledge of others of their own selfish regions. Rooibos tea is one also a perfect example of this. The bush from which the tea is made is indigenous to South Africa and have been used by the Khoisan and the San for thousands of years. They cultivated it and through trials and errors over time found out of the properties of the bush both for medical and other usage. But the patent and copyright laws have allowed the knowledge developed by the Khoisan to be exploited for commercial use. Across South Africa and the world, people drink millions of liters of rooibos tea a year, with companies making millions of rands in profit without the indigenous communities who develop rooibos tea as seeing a single cent of this. This has gone so far as 1994, the rooibos tea was patented in the United States, with the Department of Trade and Industry having to get involved in international copyright disputes. The amendments which the Portfolio Committee in time discussed and proposed must be well defined with no loopholes. Amendments are needed to protect our people and their ideas from exploitation of this white settlers that seems to take our people's ideas. But at the same time, these amendments must allow individuals and trademark obstacles, ideas, concepts, and phrases that are used by South Africans and belong to us as our people collectively and should not be the property of a single individual. We can rest assured that the EFF will fight for these individuals. We will make sure that this piece of legislation protects our indigenous communities, will protect our black communities that these white people seek to exploit and take our ideas. We will not, and not again, that these white people take our ideas and make it as their own. I so move. Thanks, Chair.
The IFP.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Copyright Amendment Bill drawn up by the Department of Trade and Industry includes many of the creator rights that are sorely needed still in South Africa. Although this is an interim report, a huge amount of work has already gone into creating rights for performers, writers, and artists to call on the law to protect their right to earn from their work. Having said that, the bill still falls short and fails to take into account a few fundamental principles and guidelines that should be the foundation and inform a well-defined legislation. The bill introduced limitations and exemptions without considering the effects that it would have on the welfare of the right holders. The introducing of new rights, the resale of royalty rights, the amble or vesting of the state with copyright ownership of or for works made under the direction, funding, or control of the state has little to do with the updating of copyright laws. South Africa already has existing good copyright legislation, but this needed to be updated principally due to technological developments. Many hours have been spent by members of the DTI and various stakeholders, and we trust that legal certainty will be the guiding principle that balances the rights and interests of those that stand to be affected by the proposed amendments to modernize our Copyright Act in a forward and a positive direction for all of South Africa. The IFP support this interim report and the process for further amendments to be implemented. I thank you.
The NFP.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, the National Freedom Party welcomes the report of the Department of Trade and Industry on the Copyright Amendment Bill tabled here today. The amendment is long overdue. For too long, a few of them have exploited the situation, particularly in our country, at the expense of the majority of South Africans. Honorable Speaker, the bill tabled here today seeks to define certain words and expressions to allow for the production of the Copyright Act, in essence, to provide for the protection of copyrights in artistic work. It further calls for the registration of collecting agencies or societies, and also provides for procedures in settling disputes on royalties. Honorable Speaker, the amendment seeks to provide protection of authorship to orphans and also seeks to ensure access for persons with disability in respect of copyright work. It further provides for the appointments of members of the Intellectual Property Tribunal, including the powers of the tribunal. Honorable Speaker, one example is this: if you take particularly medicines in South Africa, you can buy a similar product that will perform equally as good, which in India will cost you 1 rupee, and in South Africa it will cost you 360 rand. Now this intellectual property rights or copyright, what it actually did is it ensured a few, particularly the major organizations, have benefited at the expense of the poorest of the poor. So in essence, I think the National Freedom Party is of opinion that this amendment tabled here today will go a long way in leveling the playing field, particularly in the interest of individuals. The National Freedom Party supports the amendment tabled here today.
Honorable Khadebe.
Honorable Speaker, I'll just say it up front that the African National Congress support this interim report. This interim report is very important because our creators of land, our creators of music, our creators of literature have been losing a lot for many years. I'll make a first example. If you look at stalwarts like Ulento, Ubaba Umahlatini, Umbodlomane, he passed on being an indigent person, whereas his music was being played all over the country, all over the continent. But what is very important about this bill which we are dealing with, is that it addresses new technology which is in place. Around 1978, when the PGs were still a popular group, there was no YouTube. But I just checked last week, one of their songs, How Deep Is Your Love? For one day, there were about 172 million hits. About 172 million hits on that day. The issue is, if in South Africa, we don't have that protection, it means that in America or in the UK, the PGs, the orphans or the beneficiaries of the foundation of the PGs, they are going to receive royalties for that music, even if the group has long diminished. But what happens, when I looked in South Africa, I looked at the performance of Mama Umere Makeba, her song Pata Pata. Last week for one day in YouTube, it had the hits of about 1.7 million. The issue is, does the foundation of Mama Umere Makeba did get that money for that day? Because YouTube was going to get that. So this bill we're dealing with is about protecting those rights. But what is very important, we know that, as Honorable Kachalia has said here, they're not going to support this bill. Because this bill is fundamental, because it's going to introduce the new offenses. If a radio station is going to play any music without keeping record of how many times they play that music, the CEO of that radio station is going to be charged criminally. Something which has not happened before. So that's why they know that we're touching the capital now. That's why they're scrambling away, they're trying to block it. But what is very important is that when there's a dispute on the royalties, this bill is going to provide for the Copyright Tribunal
which is going to be manned by the retired judges. And those retired judges are going to be ensure that there's a fair share of the distribution of royalties. It's very simple. Where the conflicts come in, you find that with the current law, the person who gains most on copyright is the person who's going to produce an act. But the actors who are acting there, who are making that play, are not going to benefit. So what is going to happen is going to bring that balance in. So I appeal for this House that it supports this interim bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Honourable Members, I put the question again. Are there any objections to the committee being granted permission in terms of Rule 286, Sub-Rule 4, Paragraph C, to inquire into amending other provisions of the Copyright Act? Are there any objections? No objections. Agreed to. The Secretary will read the last order of the day.
Consideration of request for approval by Parliament of agreement establishing a tripartite free trade area, TFTA, among the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA, the East African Community, EAC, and the Southern African Development Community, SADC, in terms of Section 231(2) of the Constitution.
I now invite the Honourable Fabs, the chairperson of the committee, who will introduce the report. The Honourable Fabs.
Thank you, Honourable House Chair. It gives me great pleasure after many years, you know, when we're looking at regional integration and so on and the harmonization of borders, to come here to the House for the ratification of the agreement establishing the tripartite free trade area among the Southern African Development Community, the Community of the Eastern and Southern Africa, and the East African Community, UMA. So today, it's almost a celebration. I see ministers who were formerly in this area of international relations. I see the Minister of Trade and Industry and Finance, ministers who have worked with us over many, many years, and indeed members of this House. In accordance with Section 231(2) of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, we present this agreement for ratification. This agreement is anchored on development, on integration, and that is the whole thing, market integration. We can't talk about regional industrialization unless we actually have this, infrastructure and so on. It creates a single, so important, a single set of rules for trade among the 3 African communities, very different communities, that there is a need to bring together and say, do we agree on X, Y, Z? That is important, so that the prospects of stimulating industrialization, employment, not only in our own country, but in Africa, income generation, and poverty reduction. What we can be aware of is, what is the population of this area? Is it 10 million, 60 million? What is it? It is nearly 630 million people that we will be interacting with as South Africans. That's what's important. As you might be aware, the intra-African trade is estimated at a very low figure currently, 16%. But this agreement provides a framework to address the issues of industrialization and infrastructure. We know that there is increased protectionism globally, and that then underlines the importance of ratifying this agreement. We need to diversify our export markets. We need to trade more with Africa, intra-African trade. And this ratification would be a positive step in this direction. Honourable Chair, yes. When the Department of Trade and Industry presented the agreement to the Portfolio Committee, we recognised the potential benefits, and members of the committee raised what are the possible threats, what are the possible advantages to our economy. But I'm pleased to say that the department returned to the Portfolio Committee to provide further details on potential risks. And at this point then, Honourable Chair, we can safely say that the additional details and information that the department provided is an elaboration of the effective implementation of the agreement of various agencies, including SARS. And we appreciate the collaborative effort between the department and the relevant agency of state. There are currently 3 countries that have ratified the agreement: Egypt, Uganda, and Kenya. And therefore, having been the 19th country to sign the agreement, we would like to ask this House here today for South Africa's ratification of the agreement, because this will send a strong signal to all our countries involved. I thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Are there any objections to the approval of the agreement establishing the tripartite free trade area as it appears on the order paper? There's no objections,
Chair.
but there's a request for declarations.
Yeah, thank you.
The DA.
Thank you very much, House Chairperson. The DA supports the ratification of the TFTA, but there are some very serious concerns that we need to highlight. Now, we can only take advantage of the TFTA with a growing and expanding economy that gives us goods to export into those areas duty-free. The problem is that we have an economy that is in recession, we have a manufacturing sector that is in decline and defaulting, and we have ministers, as the Minister of Finance said, who's unaware to when a recession is about to strike. In the manufacturing sector, just in the last quarter, we lost 105,000 jobs. So the truth of the matter is that although we may agree to a free trade area, we are the ones that are not going to be able to take advantage of it. Because at the heart of this is a customs system and a customs office that does not protect South Africa from the import of cheap and illegal goods into our country. We need a competent service that looks after our borders and looks after our manufacturers. We also need to have an ease of doing business in order for us to take advantage of the TFTA. Just this morning, I told the Trade and Industry Committee how you need 1,000 pieces of paper and $130 to get goods from Durban Port into Namibia. That seems ludicrous and doesn't allow us to take advantage of free trade areas. And we also need to ensure that we support our exporters, the few that still exist, to be able to take advantage of these free trade areas. We need a Department of Trade and Industry that goes on aggressive investor and opportunity missions to find them new business. And what we also need to see in this TFTA is to ensure the ease of movement for business people to come into South Africa and do business here. It is far too hard for far too many business people to enter our country. I just use an example of a steel smelter in Port Elizabeth that is owned by an Indian consortium, and they cannot get a visa to come into this country to come and view their own business. It seems completely ludicrous. So while the DTI may present a whole bunch of turnaround strategies and opportunities for South Africa, we as the Department of Trade and Industry Portfolio Committee need to continue to play our role of oversight and hold the Department of Finance and the Department of DTI accountable and ensure that our manufacturers and our exporters can take advantage of this free trade area. Thank you very much.
Honourable Paulson.
Honourable Chair, the sixth non-negotiable cardinal pillar of the EFF's founding manifesto speaks to the need for rapid development of the African economy. The founding manifesto further states that the development of South Africa is inextricably linked to the development of the African continent. No amount of sustainable socio-economic development and stability will be realized in South Africa unless the state plays an active role in the economic development of the African continent. This obviously should include the development of trade corridors that link up the entire African continent and create capacity to consume goods and services produced on the continent. This is a re-emphasis of the numerous plans developed by thought leaders in our continent, that there will be no self-perpetuating development of any country in the continent if that development is not at the same time pan-African in nature and entails the unity and integration of the African continent as a unitary trading zone. The Abuja Treaty had exactly this idea, but it was aborted by the neoliberals who took over the governance of the continent. For this reason, we support the establishment of the free trade zone between COMESA, EAC and SADC. It must be the first step towards complete economic unity of the African continent. This unity must find expression in the unitization of the African resources by African people for their own development. We must have the necessary capacity to use our own resources for industrial development. That is only possible through a unified Africa free of internal trade barriers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honourable Member. The IFP.
Thank you, House Chair. This free trade agreement for Africa is possibly the most significant event in and for Africa as a whole, and its significance seems to have been largely underestimated, which can now be clearly seen when juxtaposed against the looming international trade wars sparked by US President Donald Trump and the UK's Brexit negotiations. The IFP is of the opinion that it absolutely makes good business sense to diversify and spread risk, which in this agreement is doing, not only for South Africa, but for the continent as a whole. Our goal of partnering with markets and operators elsewhere in Africa is based on research and first-hand experience of working on the continent and seeing the potential, which I might add is near limitless in terms of both natural and human resources. Like most countries in Africa, though, we also face many challenges. Africa is known for its poor critical infrastructure, porosity of its borders, and the demon of corruption, which remains so rife, and port charters, which are among the most unproductive and expensive in the world. Those challenges must be overcome throughout Africa for this agreement to work. For now, South Africa remains one of the three major gateways to the African market, with existing infrastructure, logistics, banking, manufacturing capabilities, education, and legal structures. South Africa can and should play a leading role in this free trade area agreement and assist other African countries to unlock the potential of their own market. Our aim should be to improve the export of value-added products, and opportunities are already opening up. It's time for African leaders and business to get involved in intra-African trade in order to ensure Africa's current and future economic freedom. The IFP supports the agreement.
The NFP.
Thank you, Honourable House Chair. Honourable Chairperson, the National Freedom Party welcomes the report of the Department of Trade and Industry on the agreement in establishing a tripartite free trade area amongst the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, the East African Community, and the Southern African Development Community, which is SADC, with a total membership, Honourable Chairperson, of 27 African countries. Honourable Chairperson, this is an important step and an initiative in accelerating regional integration efforts aimed at ensuring improvement in the inter-Africa trade. It also forms the basis for the ongoing continental free trade negotiations to unlock trade and investment opportunities in the entire African continent. Now, Honourable Chairperson, while this is a great initiative and entering into this trade agreement is one thing, ensuring that it benefits the country and its people, if not taken advantage of, is another thing, Honourable Chairperson. One of the challenges we seem to have had is, and I think I spoke to one of the ministers earlier on, is the manufacturing industry in South Africa. And particularly with the rand-dollar rate, the exports and how it could actually benefit South Africa extensively. And we find if you take particularly the manufacturing industry, while the automotive industry has improved, the textile, leather and plastic industries have declined considerably, resulting in job losses. Now, if we could take advantage of this and export to the neighboring countries, the regional and Africa, it will actually stimulate economic growth in South Africa. So what as the National Freedom Party, we are calling on government to take advantage of this agreement so that it benefits our people in the country. And one good example is the manufacturing of medicines. Now, we rely extensively, particularly on like the United States of America and things for our medicines. And I know that we've had extensive discussions in the SADC region in terms of creating a factory, an industry in the SADC region alone so that it could become self-sufficient but also export to all the other countries. So in light of that, and provided we take advantage of this, Honorable Chairperson, we believe it will benefit South Africans extensively. The National Freedom Party, as a result thereof, will support this. Thank you.
The UDM.
Thank you very much, House Chair. The United Democratic Movement supports the ratification of the TFTA agreement, primarily because we feel that we're providing as a continent leadership in this area when the rest of the country, the West rather, is moving in the opposite direction where there's rise in protectionism and unilateralism. As Africa, we're leading by example to say, let us work together to improve trade and improve and encourage issues of regional integration. The other issue that is important is that, look, we have to first and foremost improve intra-Africa trade if we want to lift Africa out of the malaise of poverty and underdevelopment as a strategy, meaning we have to find a way of trading with ourselves on the continent. But I think I want to caution us as we embark upon this process that at times we fail to resist the illogical temptation to think that when we open up trade issues that we should not do it in a manner that is mutually beneficial. It's not about South Africa benefiting alone out of this process. It's about us as a continent benefit mutually out of the trade agreements that we're putting in place and the creation of the free trade area. Why am I making this point? Last year, we asked, for instance, President Zuma a question. We said, what steps has the country taken to ensure, A, the facilitation of this process, which is the TFTA, and that unlike most free trade agreements, the CFTA at the time does not skew trade and development in favor of more developed countries on the continent. When you look at the agreement and read its objectives, it outlines clearly, especially when it says adopting common standards of trade procedures within the tripartite free trade area where international requirements do not suit the conditions or prevailing conditions and where they might actually affect the interests of member states, that would serve as an important consideration. It is, among other reasons, the reason why we feel that this is an important agreement for Africa trade and for regional integration. Madiba, Sanon Pazamis. We thank you very much.
Thank you, Honourable Member. The ANC.
Chairperson, the foundational policy framework of the African National Congress of its international relations policy is encompassed in the Freedom Charter adopted in 1955, which declares that there shall be peace and friendship. The Freedom Charter therefore prescribes that the ANC and South Africa's foreign policy outlook should emphasize peace and friendship as opposed to war and coercion. When South Africa joined the OAU, a number of treaties has already been agreed by the member states of the OAU. Among the treaties is the Abuja Treaty of 1991, in which the OAU agreed to establish African Economic Community. It is this treaty and many others that guides the activities of the African National Congress-led government in the continent. At its national conference in 2017, the ANC resolved that Africa and its development remains the central objective of the ANC's international perspective and policy, with the African Renaissance remaining a key objective. The conference further reaffirmed that the ANC and ANC government remains committed to peaceful and prosperous Africa in pursuit of the aspirations of the Agenda 2063 of the AU. When coming to the issue of the Tripartite Free Trade Area, Chair, it is an initiative which is consistent with the imperatives of the Abuja Treaty of the AU to establish an African economic community. The EU views regional economic communities as the building blocks towards the African economic community. Hence, the Tripartite Free Trade Area is seen as a building block which fills to the Africa-wide continental trade area. This is an indication by the African policymakers of the need for major trade policy to reform among the African countries. The Tripartite Free Trade Area Agreement represents a large supply of young, dynamic, and potentially very productive labor force. The specific objectives of this agreement: one is the progressive elimination of tariffs and non-tariff barriers to trade and goods, liberalize trade and services, cooperate on customs matters and implementation of trade facilitation measures. It establish and promote cooperation in all trade-related areas among the tripartite members, establish and maintain institutional framework for implementation and the administration of the Tripartite Free Trade Area. The member states of the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement are determined to progressively liberalize the goods and services, promote industrial development, facilitate movement of business persons, support strengthening of infrastructure, promote competitiveness, build the capacity of micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises, and continue to the deepening of integration of the Tripartite Free Trade Area. The Tripartite Free Trade Area brings about 26 countries together, representing 48% of the AU membership, with a combined population of 632 million people, which contributes 51% of the continental GDP. As Africa continues its program of economic integration of the continent, the impact of economic partnership agreement, both bilateral and multilateral, must be given serious attention. If this House ratifies this agreement, it will be in fulfillment of the founding fathers of the AU, like former President of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who once said, "By far the greatest wrong the departing colonists inflicted on Africa was the state of disunity of Africa, which left us divided into economically unviable states which bore no possibility of redevelopment." If this House supports this agreement, it means that that historic mission will be helping fulfilled. As the ANC, we fully support the Tripartite Free Trade Area Agreement as it is in line with our foreign policy objectives. The agreement further emphasizes the commitment of South Africa to advance the agenda of the economic development of Africa. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Member. The question is thus agreed to. There's no objections. Before we adjourn the House, I just want to make the following announcement. Members are reminded that His Excellency, President Cyril Ramaphosa, together with the Speaker of the National Assembly and the Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces, will today launch the theme books published to celebrate the Constitution and the centenary birthdays of Madiba and Masisulu. The launch will take place today at 5:30 p.m. in the old Assembly Chamber. That concludes the business for the day, and the House is adjourned.